The postcard I sent him from Tokyo was small, maybe 4 inches wide, with a picture of Mount Fuji at dawn, the sky behind it streaked pink and gold, like something out of a painting you'd never believe was real. On the back, I wrote exactly 9 words in my neatest handwriting. Sonny, my time is just beginning. Love, Mom. I addressed it to the house in Harrowfield where he'd grown up, where I had lived for 39 years, where the keys he'd been carrying for the last 14 months no longer fit the locks. He received it on a Thursday. By then, I was already home. The attorney had already filed the paperwork. The locks had already been changed. And my son Conrad, who had looked me in the eye 8 months earlier and told me that I had had my time, was standing on my front porch with a key that did nothing but scratch the brass plate. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because the woman who sent that postcard was not the woman I was on the evening in October when Conrad sat down across from me at my own kitchen table and told me what he had decided about my life. That woman still believed that her son, whatever his flaws, loved her in the way that sons are supposed to love their mothers. That woman still thought the worst thing Conrad had done was forget her birthday 2 years in a row. That woman had not yet opened the drawer of the mahogany nightstand on the left side of the bed, Victor's side, the side I still couldn't bring myself to sleep on, and found what was waiting there, filed neatly in a manila envelope, as if it were simply a document among documents, as if it were nothing at all. All of that came later. First, there was the kitchen, and the tea going cold between us, and my son's voice taking on that particular quality it got when he had already made a decision and was now explaining it to you as though you had a say. I want to tell you how this started. Not with Conrad, not exactly. It started with a photograph. Victor and I had been married for 41 years when he died, and for 32 of those years, he had kept a photograph in his wallet. Not a photograph of me, though there was one of those too tucked behind his library card. This was a picture he had cut carefully from a travel magazine in 1991. A picture of Mount Fuji reflected in a lake, the water so still it looked like mercury. The mountain doubled, existing once in the sky and once below the surface, as if the world had been folded in half along some invisible seam. Victor had seen it on a lunch break, sitting in the park near his office with a sandwich he hadn't finished, and he had taken out his penknife and cut the page out with the kind of care most people reserve for things that matter. He carried it for 32 years. The edges went soft. The colors faded at the creases. But every time he took it out to show someone, and he showed a lot of people over the years, he'd smooth it against his palm first, like he was ironing a shirt. "That's where we're going," he used to say. Every few years, he'd say it again. When the kids were small and money was thin, "That's where we're going one day." When I went back to work at the school library and we had a bit more coming in, "Japan is getting closer." When his knees started giving him trouble in his late 50s and the doctor mentioned that long-haul flights weren't ideal, "We'll go when I'm better." He was always going to be better. That was Victor. He approached the future the way he approached a difficult crossword puzzle, with patience and a quiet, unshakable certainty that the answer existed somewhere, that it would come. He died in March on a Tuesday in the small hours before dawn. His heart simply stopped. The hospice nurse called me at 4 a.m, and I sat in the kitchen in my dressing gown until the sun came up, drinking tea I didn't taste, listening to the house make its noises around me. The boiler clicking on, the wind in the eaves, the refrigerator humming to itself in that slightly off-key way it had hummed for 15 years. All the familiar sounds of a life continuing without consulting you first. The children came. Rena flew in from Manchester with her husband and the 3 kids, And she held my hand and cried in a way that was pure and unashamed, the way she had always cried since she was small. Conrad arrived with his wife Valerie the following afternoon, and he was efficient and kind in the careful, managed way he had been efficient and kind since his 20s, shaking hands with the funeral director, making calls, handling the logistics of a death the way he handled the logistics of everything, as if grief were a project with deliverables and a timeline. I was grateful for him then. I was genuinely grateful. It is important that you understand that, because what came later could make you think I had always seen him clearly, and I hadn't. I loved my son. I believed he loved me. I believed that the slightly controlling quality he had, the tendency to take over, to steer, to decide, I believed it came from caring. I was wrong about that. But I was wrong about it honestly, for a long time. The 6 months after Victor's death were what I would call the gray months. I am not saying this for sympathy. I am saying it because it's accurate. The world lost its color in a way that was not dramatic. There was no weeping in the grocery store, no inability to get out of bed, no crisis that anyone would have recognized as a crisis. I simply went about my days in a kind of low-resolution version of myself. I cooked because I had always cooked. I walked to the library. I'd retired 3 years before, but I still volunteered on Tuesdays, because I had always walked to the library on Tuesdays. I called Rena on Sunday evenings and Conrad on Sunday mornings, and I said I was fine. And mostly I was, in the way that fine can mean simply, I am still here, I am still moving, nothing is actively wrong. What I was not doing was living, and I knew the difference. Victor had known the difference too, which is why he had kept that photograph. I found it in September when I finally sorted through his nightstand. I'd been avoiding it, not from grief exactly, more from a sense that some things deserve to wait until you're ready. The wallet was in the top drawer, along with his reading glasses and a tube of hand cream and a small notebook he'd used for crossword answers when he didn't want to write in the puzzle itself. I opened the wallet almost without thinking, and the photograph was there, folded twice now because the wallet had gotten thinner over the years, but still there, still Fuji, still that impossible mirror lake. I sat on the edge of the bed, his side, which I still couldn't bring myself to sleep on, and I held the photograph for a long time. Then I opened my laptop and I started looking at flights to Japan. This is what I need you to understand about that moment. I was not being impulsive. I was not having some kind of grief-fueled breakdown. I was 68 years old. I had my health, high blood pressure, managed with medication, and a knee that complained in damp weather, but nothing that stopped me from walking 3 miles on a Tuesday. I had my pension and Victor's life insurance and the money from selling his car, and I had, for the first time in 41 years, nothing in particular to stop me. The children were grown, the house was paid for, there was no one who needed me to stay. I spent 3 weeks planning the trip. I bought a guidebook, 2 of them actually, and I read them the way I used to read novels, in bed at night with a cup of chamomile tea, making notes in the margins. I found a small hotel in Tokyo that had English-speaking staff and a breakfast room that looked, from the photographs, like something from a dream. I looked up the accessibility of the temples in Kyoto because of my knee. I downloaded a translation app. I booked a 3-week trip for the 2nd week of April, cherry blossom season, though the guidebook warned me the timing was unpredictable. And I paid for it with my own credit card, the one that had only ever had my name on it. And when the confirmation email arrived, I sat at the kitchen table and I cried for the first time since Victor died. Not from sadness, from something that felt, after 6 months of gray, startlingly like joy. I made the mistake of telling Conrad on a Sunday morning phone call. I should have waited. I know that now. I should have waited until the tickets were bought, which they were, and the hotels booked, which they were, and it was simply a fact to be reported rather than a plan to be discussed. But I was excited, genuinely excited, for the first time in months, and Conrad was my son, and I thought he would be happy for me. "Japan," he said. There was a pause that lasted too long. "Mom, what are you talking about?" I explained about the photograph, about Victor's dream, about finding it in the wallet. I tried to keep my voice light. I mentioned the hotel with the English-speaking staff, the translation app, the guidebook. "You're planning to go to Japan?" he said, as if he were repeating it back to himself to confirm he had heard correctly. "Alone?" "I am," I said. "In April." Another pause. "Mom," his voice had shifted into what I privately called his boardroom register. Calm, measured, already a step ahead of you. "I think we need to talk about this properly, not on the phone." "I'm happy to talk," I said, "but I've already booked it." The silence that followed was different from the others. It had a quality to it, a density. "I'll come down on Saturday," he said. "Valerie will come too." He arrived at 10:30, which was earlier than I had expected, and he had brought a folder. This should have told me something. Conrad brought folders to conversations he expected to win. The kitchen was warm. I had made tea and a plate of the shortbread biscuits he'd liked since childhood, and we sat at the table where we had always sat, and for a few minutes it felt almost normal. Valerie asked about the garden. I told her the roses had done well this year despite the wet summer. Conrad helped himself to a second biscuit and talked about his firm's Q3 numbers in that way he had, as if you had asked when you hadn't. The morning light came through the window above the sink and lay across the table in long, pale strips, and for just a moment, looking at my son in that light, I felt the ordinary tenderness of a mother looking at a child who had grown up. He had Victor's jaw. He'd always had Victor's jaw. Then he opened the folder. "I've done some research," he said, in the boardroom voice. He laid papers on the table. There was a printout from an NHS website about the risks of long-haul travel for adults over 65 with cardiovascular conditions. There was something printed from a travel safety site about Japan's healthcare system and the difficulty of navigating it without Japanese language skills. There was a page of what appeared to be statistics about falls in elderly travelers, with certain figures highlighted in yellow. I looked at the papers. I looked at my son. I picked up my teacup because I needed something to do with my hands. "Conrad," I said carefully, "I am 68, not 102. You have high blood pressure, Mom, which is controlled. My doctor is perfectly happy with my numbers." "That's not what Dr. Hargreaves told me," he said. The teacup stopped halfway to my lips. "I beg your pardon?" Conrad met my eyes. He had, I will give him this, the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "I rang Dr. Hargreaves just to get a professional perspective. He expressed some concerns." I set the teacup down very precisely in the center of its saucer. "You telephoned my doctor." "He's known our family for years. He is my doctor," I said, "not yours. And my medical information, Mom." He reached across the table and put his hand over mine, the way you'd soothe a child who was getting worked up. The gesture made something cold and sharp move through my chest. "I'm not trying to upset you. I'm worried about you. You're still grieving. You're not thinking clearly." "I am thinking extremely clearly," I said. I removed my hand from under his. "You want to fly 16 hours alone to a country where you don't speak the language, where you have no contacts, where if something happened to you—" "If something happened to me," I said, "I would deal with it." The way I dealt with everything for the last 8 years while your father was ill. The way I have dealt with things my entire adult life." He looked at me. Then he looked at Valerie. Some kind of communication passed between them. Quick, practiced, the language of two people who have discussed a subject extensively before arriving at this meeting. "Mom," Valerie said, and her voice was gentle, the specific gentleness of someone performing gentleness. "We just think, given where you are emotionally right now, that a trip like this might be a lot. There's no shame in waiting, in taking more time." "I have been taking time," I said. "For 6 months I have been taking time. I have cooked Victor's favorite dinners and sat at Victor's kitchen table and slept on my side of Victor's bed. And I have taken a great deal of time. I am done taking time. I am going to Japan." Conrad sat back in his chair. He let out a breath through his nose, a slow, controlled exhalation that I recognized as his version of counting to 10. "What if we compromised?" he said. "A trip within Europe, France maybe, or Portugal, somewhere closer, somewhere manageable. And then, if that goes well—" "I don't want to go to France," I said. "I want to go to Japan. I have wanted to go to Japan for 30 years. Victor wanted to go to Japan for 32 years. He carried a photograph of Mount Fuji in his wallet for 32 years, and he died without ever seeing it. And I am not going to die the same way." The kitchen went quiet. Outside, a car went past on the road. The refrigerator hummed. "Mom," Conrad said, and his voice had changed again. Quieter now, almost gentle, but with something underneath it. Something that sat wrong, the way a note in a piece of music sits wrong when it's a half step off. "You've had your time. You and Dad. You had 41 good years. You had a good life together. That's more than most people get. But you're not 25. There's no shame in accepting that." The words landed. I felt them land. Not all at once. First, the surface meaning, then, a second later, the deeper one. You've had your time. Like a season that was over, like something to be folded up and put away. I looked at my son, this person I had raised, this person I had driven to football practice and helped with his university applications and held in the maternity ward 44 years ago when he was red-faced and outraged at the world. And I felt something move in me. Not anger, not yet. Something colder. Something that said, "Look closer." "I think," I said, and my voice came out entirely steady, which surprised me, "that it's time for you to go." "Mom, the visit is over, Conrad." I stood up. "I'll talk to you on Sunday." He started to say something else. Valerie touched his arm. After a moment, they both stood, and Conrad gathered his folder, and Valerie kissed me on the cheek, and they went. I stood in the kitchen after the front door closed, and I listened to Conrad's car back out of the drive. Then I sat back down at the table, and I poured myself another cup of tea from the pot, which was nearly cold. And I sat with the phrase turning over in my mind like a stone in a tumbler. You've had your time. I did not cry. I don't know why. I had expected to. Instead, I sat there with the cold tea and the plate of shortbread, one biscuit left, and I thought about Victor's photograph, and I thought about my son's folder with its highlighted statistics, and I thought about the word compromised, and the way he'd said it, and the way he'd called Dr. Hargreaves behind my back without a moment's hesitation, and the way Valerie had looked at him before she spoke. Not a glance of a wife following her husband's lead, but the glance of a partner checking in, making sure the script was going to plan. I finished the last shortbread biscuit. I washed up the teacups. I went to bed at my normal time and lay on my side of the mattress, staring at the ceiling. And I did not sleep for a very long time. 3 days later, I found the document. I had been meaning to sort through Victor's nightstand properly. The first time, in September, I'd taken out the wallet and the photograph and hadn't gone further. On a Wednesday morning, with nothing particular to do and a restlessness I couldn't quite name, I decided to finish the job. I took out the small notebook, the reading glasses, the hand cream, a church bulletin from the previous Christmas, a bus timetable from 2019, a pack of tissues, 3 left. At the very back of the drawer, pushed to the rear, there was a manila envelope. My name was written on it in Conrad's handwriting. I sat very still for a moment. The envelope wasn't sealed. The flap was just tucked in, not gummed down. And I opened it the way you open something when your hands already know something is wrong before your brain catches up. My fingers felt thick and slow. The paper inside was crisp, official, printed on headed notepaper from a firm of solicitors in town. It was a lasting power of attorney document for property and financial affairs, in my name, granting authority to Conrad James Whitmore, dated 3 months ago. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time, more slowly, because I was looking for the part where I had misunderstood. There was a signature at the bottom, above my printed name. It looked like my signature. The loops on the M, the slight backward slant I had never been able to correct. It looked like something I would have signed. It looked very much like something I would have signed. I had no memory of signing it. None. Not a dim recollection of a document I'd glanced at and not really read, not a vague sense of a solicitor's office I'd visited and half forgotten. Nothing. Blank. The kind of blank that, when you stare at it long enough, stops feeling like a simple gap in memory and starts feeling like an answer in itself. My hands were trembling. I realized this slowly, the way you realize things when your mind is working very fast on one track and your body is several steps behind. The paper was shaking. The legal language blurred and steadied and blurred again. I set the document on the bed, Victor's side, as if proximity to where he had slept might help me think, and I pressed my palms flat against my thighs until they stopped shaking. Think, Margaret, I thought. A lasting power of attorney for financial affairs, which meant that if it were registered with the Office of the Public Guardian, and I did not yet know if it was, Conrad would have the legal authority to manage my bank accounts, my pension, the house. He could, in theory, sell the house. He had been managing my affairs for months, since Victor died, because I had asked him to help me understand the paperwork, the accounts, the things Victor had always handled. I had given him access. I had given him access because he was my son and I trusted him. I sat on the edge of the bed for a very long time. The light changed around me as the morning went on. At some point, I became aware that my back ached from the way I was sitting, hunched slightly forward. And I straightened, and I noticed that my tea, I had made a cup before coming upstairs, was sitting cold on the dresser where I'd set it down and forgotten it. You've had your time. The words had a different weight now. I picked up the document. I read it again. I looked at the signature. And then, because there was one more thing I needed to understand before I could decide what to do, I opened my laptop and I searched the name of the firm of solicitors on the headed paper. They were local, a firm in the town center, 2 streets from the train station, specializing in wills and probate and residential property. Residential property. I closed the laptop. I sat for another moment. Then I picked up the phone and I called my daughter. Rena answered on the 3rd ring, her voice carrying the background noise of her house. One of the children shouting something, a television somewhere. Mom, hang on, let me just... The noise receded as she moved to another room. Sorry, it's chaos here. Are you okay? I'm fine, I said. Old habit. Rena, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. A pause. Of course. Did you know that Conrad had a power of attorney document drawn up in my name? The silence that followed told me everything before she spoke. It was too long, a quarter second too long, a fraction that would have meant nothing in any other context, but which, right now, in this moment, with a document on the bed beside me, was a full confession. "Mom," she said, She stopped, started again. "He said it was practical," he said, "just in case something happened to you, just so someone could manage things, and he said you'd agreed to it." "I did not agree to it," I said, quietly, precisely. "I did not sign that document, or if I did not know what I was signing." And I want you to think very carefully about what that means, Rena. Another silence. When she spoke again, her voice was different, smaller, the voice she'd had as a girl when she knew she'd done something wrong. "He said you were having a hard time since Dad died. He said you weren't managing well. He said," "When did he tell you this?" "A few months ago. July, maybe." July. 4 months after Victor died. 2 months before I'd found the photograph and booked the trip. "Rena," I said, "I love you. And I know that Conrad is your brother and that this is uncomfortable. But I need to know one more thing. Do you know if the document has been registered?" I don't know. He didn't say. Mom, I swear I didn't know it was. I thought you knew. I thought. Her voice broke slightly. "Is this why he came down last weekend? About the Japan trip?" "I believe so," I said. "Yes." The call lasted another 20 minutes, and by the end, Rena was crying properly and promising that she hadn't known, that she would have said something, that she was sorry. And I believed her. Not entirely, not without reservation, but enough. Rena had always been a follower where Conrad was concerned, always deferred to the older sibling who had always known better, always had a plan. She had not conspired. She had simply not asked questions she should have asked. I told her not to say anything to Conrad yet. I said I would handle it. I kept my voice perfectly calm throughout, which seemed to disturb her more than if I had wept. I hung up. I drank the cold tea because I needed something. It tasted of nothing. I looked out the window at the back garden. The roses were dying back now, going papery and brown at the edges, and I let myself feel, for precisely 5 minutes, all of it. The betrayal, the slow, sick realization of how long this had been in motion. The thought of my son sitting across from me with his folder and his statistics, so confident, so assured, while in a drawer upstairs sat a document that told the real story. The thought of my signature, however he'd obtained it, whether I'd signed something without reading it, whether he'd forged it, on a legal instrument designed to take the management of my life out of my hands. 5 minutes. Then I stood up, and I put the document back in the envelope, and I put the envelope in my handbag, and I went downstairs and looked up the name of the best solicitor in town. Her name was Patricia Okafor, and she had an office above a pharmacy on the high street, and her secretary gave me an appointment for the following Monday. I did not tell Conrad I was going. I did not tell anyone. The weekend was the strangest I had spent since Victor died. Conrad called on Sunday morning at the usual time, and I answered, and we spoke for 12 minutes about nothing in particular. He asked about the garden, I asked about his work. He did not mention Japan, I did not mention the envelope in my handbag. I was aware throughout the call of a quality in my own voice that I had not heard before. It was steady. It was almost pleasant. It was the voice of a woman who knows something, who has decided something, and who is not yet ready to show her hand. Valerie said hello briefly near the end of the call. Her voice had its usual careful warmth. I said it was lovely to hear from her. I thanked her for coming down the previous Saturday. She said, of course, any time. After I hung up, I sat looking at the phone in my hand for a long moment. On Sunday afternoon, I called an old friend, Dorothy, who had been my closest friend for 30 years, who had known Victor, who had known Conrad since he was 6, and had never particularly warmed to him the way she'd warmed to Rena. Dorothy picked up immediately, which was characteristic of her. "Maggie," she said, and something in her voice shifted when she heard mine. "What's happened?" I told her. Not everything, not yet. I didn't have all the information, but the shape of it, the Saturday visit, the folder, the things Conrad had said, the document in the nightstand. Dorothy listened without interrupting, which was not her usual mode, and when I finished, there was a silence during which I could almost hear her thinking. "Margaret Agnes Whitmore," she said finally, which was what she called me when she was completely serious. "I know. You are going to that solicitor on Monday." "I am." "And you are going to Japan." "I am," I said. And saying it, for the first time since Conrad's visit, felt like putting something back in its rightful place. Dorothy came over that evening. She brought wine, which I didn't particularly want but appreciated, and she sat at the kitchen table in Victor's old chair, and we talked until 11 o'clock. She told me about her own son, who had done something considerably milder, but in the same family of behaviors, assumed he knew best, rearranged things without asking, and how she had handled it. She was funny about it. In the dark way, she was funny about difficult things, and I laughed for the first time in what felt like weeks, and it hurt in a good way, like a muscle you'd forgotten you had. Dorothy had been my friend since the children were small. We had met at the school gate, both of us waiting for our respective 5-year-olds, both of us with the particular look of women who have just returned to something resembling their former selves after the infant years, and are not entirely sure they remember who that was. We had liked each other immediately, in the way that happens sometimes. Not because we were similar, because we weren't particularly, but because we found each other interesting, which is rarer and more durable. She was sharper than me, quicker with an opinion, more willing to say an uncomfortable thing in a room that did not want it said. I had always valued this. I had relied on it more than I knew until Victor died, and she was there, consistently, without requiring anything of me in return. She poured us both wine, and she listened to the whole account without interrupting, which was extraordinary for Dorothy. And when I finished, she sat back in her chair and was quiet for what felt like a long time. "Right," she said finally. "Yes," I said. "The solicitor," she said. "Monday." "Already have the appointment." She looked at me over her wineglass. Her expression was the one she wore when she was updating her opinion of something. Careful, concentrated, slightly narrowed. "You've already made the appointment." "I have." "And Japan?" "Still going." She nodded once, the way she nodded when a case was made and she was done deliberating. "Good." She drank some wine. "He underestimated you." "Badly," I agreed. "They all do, at some point," she said in a matter-of-fact way, as if this were simply a feature of the landscape. "Even the ones who love you properly. They forget, or they never quite learned, that the woman who stayed home and managed everything was managing everything, as if the ability required is less because the arena is smaller." She made a small, dismissive gesture with her hand. "Idiots." I laughed. It felt again like something unlocking. "The house," she said. There was an estate agent's card, his notes in Victor's calendar. While Victor was still alive? The notes were dated from late last year, Victor's final months. Dorothy looked at me steadily. So he was planning it before Victor died. I had thought this. I had thought it, and I had not said it aloud until now. Hearing it spoken made it more solid, and also somehow smaller. A thing that, once named, had its proper size. "I believe so," I said. Yes, Maggie. She leaned forward slightly. I want to say something, and I want you to hear it properly. You have my full attention, I said. You are not responsible for what he became. You raised him with love and good faith, and whatever failures of character he has are his, not a reflection of yours. She held my gaze. A lot of women in your position would spend a year trying to work out where they went wrong with him. I am asking you not to do that. I looked at her, my oldest friend, sharp and direct and sitting in Victor's chair with her wine glass, telling me a true thing. I'll try, I said. Good. She sat back. Now tell me about Japan. Everything you've planned. I want the full itinerary. She left at 11, and I went to bed, and I lay on my side of the mattress in the dark, and across the room on Victor's dresser was the photograph. I had taken it out of the wallet and set it there, in a small frame, looking out at the room. At this distance, in the dark, I couldn't see it, but I knew it was there. I still couldn't bring myself to sleep on his side. But I would, I thought. Eventually. There was no rush. Time was not the thing in short supply. Monday morning, I wore my good coat, the charcoal one with the velvet collar that I'd bought for Victor's firm's Christmas party 3 years ago and hadn't worn since. And I walked to Patricia Okafor's office with the envelope in my handbag and arrived 7 minutes early. The waiting room smelled of new carpet and printer paper, and there was a potted fern in the corner that looked recently watered. A receptionist who couldn't have been more than 22 offered me tea. I accepted it. It was very good tea. Patricia Okafor came out to greet me at exactly the appointed time. She was somewhere in her 40s, with close-cropped hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the air of someone who has heard a great many things and is capable of keeping her face quite still while she processes them. I liked her immediately. I showed her the document. I explained that I had no memory of signing it and could not account for the signature. I told her about Conrad's visit, about the call to my doctor, about what he had said about Japan, and about my having had my time. I was methodical and clear because I had spent the weekend organizing my thoughts, and Patricia Okafor listened with her hands folded on her desk and her expression entirely composed. When I finished, she asked 3 questions. Had I signed anything at Victor's will review meeting approximately 6 months prior, when Conrad had accompanied me? Possibly. I had signed several things that day, and Conrad had guided me through them quickly, and I had trusted him. Had the property and financial LPA been registered with the Office of the Public Guardian? She would check, but if Conrad hadn't registered it, it was currently invalid, regardless of the signature. And third, was I willing to take steps to revoke it, assuming it was genuine, and to make any changes to my own estate planning that I felt were necessary? Yes, I said, I was. She checked her system while I sat there, and after about 4 minutes, she looked up over her reading glasses. The LPA had been submitted for registration 9 weeks ago. It was not yet fully registered. There was a mandatory waiting period, which meant we had a narrow but sufficient window. You are, she said, in a tone that was entirely professionally neutral, in a fortunate position to be acting now rather than in another few weeks. I am aware of that, I said. We talked for an hour and 20 minutes. When I left, I had set in motion 3 separate things: a formal objection to the registration of the LPA on the grounds that I had no recollection of consenting to it, a review of my will with the intention of removing Conrad as sole executor, and a consultation appointment with a locksmith who worked with her firm on matters of this kind. Patricia Okafor gave me her direct line and told me to call if Conrad contacted me about any of it before she did. I walked home in the October air, which was cold and clean and smelled faintly of the leaves coming down from the plane trees along the high street. I walked past the library where I had worked for 23 years. I stopped in at the greengrocer's and bought apples and a small bunch of chrysanthemums, yellow ones. I made myself a proper lunch, not just toast, which had become a habit, and I ate it at the kitchen table with the chrysanthemums in a vase in the center. and then I called the airline about my flight to Tokyo. Everything was confirmed. April, 3 weeks. The hotel in Shinjuku with the English-speaking staff and the breakfast room that looked like a dream. "Your booking is confirmed, Mrs. Whitmore," the man on the phone said. "Thank you," I said. "I know." I expected Conrad to call again about Japan. He didn't, not immediately. I think he had decided to give me time to, as he would have put it, come to my senses. He rang on the following Sunday, same as always, and we had another conversation about nothing, smooth and careful on both sides, and I hung up feeling the strangeness of performing normality with someone you are watching from the outside now, someone whose intentions you understand with a clarity you didn't have before. Valerie sent me a recipe by email a few days later, a casserole she said I would enjoy, given the colder weather. I saved the recipe. I did not make the casserole. The real confrontation came in November, 6 weeks after the Monday meeting with Patricia. It came because Conrad rang me on a Thursday evening, which he never did, and his voice had a different quality, brisk, efficient, with something underneath that I recognized with my new eyes as controlled urgency. "Mom," he said, "I've just had a letter from a firm of solicitors." "Oh," I said. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a crossword I'd been doing before he called. I put the pen down, but didn't close the puzzle. "Which firm would that be?" "Okafor Associates," he said, "in the High Street. They've sent a letter regarding a power of attorney document." A pause. "Want to tell me what's going on?" "I think," I said carefully, "that the letter explains it fairly clearly." "Mom," boardroom voice, steadier than I'd expected, which told me he had prepared for this possibility. "I want to talk about this. Can I come down on Saturday?" "Of course," I said. "Come at 11. I'll make coffee." He came at 11, without the folder this time. I noted the absence of the folder, and without Valerie, which was also noted. He sat at the kitchen table, and I put coffee in front of him, and I sat across from him in my usual chair, and I looked at my son in the November morning light, and I was, for a moment, purely sad. Not angry, just sad. The way you are sad when you look at something and finally see it truly after a long time of almost seeing. "The document," he said, without preamble. "I had it drawn up because I was worried about you. After Dad died, you weren't yourself." "I know you were worried," I said. "You mentioned it at the time, several times. If something happened, if you had a health episode, a fall, something, and I needed to act quickly on your behalf." "Conrad," I said, "did you explain to me what the document was before I signed it?" A beat. "You came with me to the solicitors when we were sorting out the estate." "I came with you to a solicitor's office," I said. "I signed several things. You guided me through them. Did you specifically tell me that one of those documents was a lasting power of attorney for my property and financial affairs? Did you use those words? Did you explain to me that by signing it, you would have the legal authority to manage my accounts and ultimately my house?" He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. A muscle moved in his jaw. "I believed it was in your best interest," he said. "That isn't an answer to my question," I said. The silence stretched. Outside, a bird was doing something cheerful and oblivious in the garden. I waited. "I thought you understood what you were signing," he said finally. "No," I said. "You thought I would not look closely. There's a difference." He looked up at me then, and I saw something move across his face that I couldn't fully read. Not guilt exactly, not remorse, something more complicated. Calculation, maybe. Reassessment. "The solicitor mentioned a concern about the property," he said, shifting. "Something about a consultation with an estate agent?" I had not been certain he would know about that. Apparently, Patricia's letter had been specific. "Yes," I said. "I found a business card in Victor's desk. Estate agency. Carruthers and Webb. Residential sales." I thought it was odd, since Victor hadn't been in any condition to be considering anything in his last year. Then I found a note of a telephone conversation on his appointment calendar, which was in Victor's handwriting, which means Victor didn't make it. Someone else had access to his calendar and was using it. The temperature in the kitchen changed. Conrad's hands tightened on the cup, very slightly, but I had 44 years of knowing this face. "I'm not sure what you're implying," he said. "I'm not implying anything," I said. "I'm telling you what I found." He was quiet for several seconds. Then, "The house is too big for you alone. That's simply true. I've thought about it." "You've thought about it?" I said. "For some time. It's a lot to manage on your own at your age, and frankly, the property." "The property," I said, "is mine. My name is on the deed. Victor's name was on the deed. It was never your name, Conrad. It is not your decision." "If the LPA had been properly registered—" "But it wasn't," I said. "It isn't, and it won't be. The objection has been filed." Another silence. He looked, for the first time since he'd arrived, like someone who had brought a plan to a meeting and discovered that the meeting had already taken place without him. "Mom," he said, and the boardroom voice was gone, and what was underneath it was rawer, harder to name. "You're being paranoid. You're grieving, and you're not thinking straight. I have thought about nothing else for 6 weeks," I said. "Very straight indeed." I lifted my own coffee cup. My hand was perfectly steady. "I have hired a solicitor. I have filed an objection to the LPA registration. I am changing my will. I am having the locks changed on this house. And in April, I am going to Japan." I set the cup down. "Is there anything else you'd like to discuss?" He stared at me. I watched his face go through several things in quick succession. I watched him look for the angle that would work, the approach that would move me, and I watched him not find it. "The locks," he said. "You don't need to—" "I do," I said. "Yes, I'm afraid I do." He left shortly after. He did not take the coffee with him. He said very little on his way out, and the things he said were short, clipped, the words of someone keeping themselves under significant control. He said I was making a mistake. He said I would regret this. He said, and this was the one that landed, the one I had to work hardest not to respond to, that Dad would be disappointed. I stood at the door and watched him get in his car, and I did not say anything. And when he drove away, I went inside, and I stood in the hallway for a moment with my hand on the wall, and I breathed. Victor would not have been disappointed. Victor would have been furious, quietly, devastatingly furious, in the way that good men get furious when someone they trusted acts dishonorably. But I did not need to say that. There was no one to say it to. Rena called that evening. She had apparently spoken to Conrad, who had called her immediately after leaving my house. "He's very upset," she said carefully. "I imagine he is," I said. "He's saying, Mom, he's saying you're not well, that you've had some kind of—" he used the word episode. "That's convenient," I said. "An episode would explain away everything I found very tidily, wouldn't it? Make it a symptom rather than a discovery." Rena was quiet. "Rena," I said, "do you believe that I am not well? Based on what you've seen of me, in person, recently, do you believe that?" "No," she said after a moment. "No, you seem completely yourself, Mom. You seem more yourself than you have since Dad died." A pause. "I think he's scared." "He should be," I said, "not of me, of himself, of what he was prepared to do." She said she was sorry again. I told her again that I believed her. I told her I loved her and that none of this was about her. She asked, tentatively, if she could come down before Christmas. I said yes. I meant it. The winter that followed was quieter than any I could remember. Not lonely exactly. Dorothy and I met for lunch twice a month, and I volunteered at the library, and there were the neighbors and the women from my old book club, and the occasional pleasant Sunday service where I didn't believe much but liked the architecture and the music. But quiet. The conversations with Conrad had stopped. He sent an email in early December, formal and careful, saying he hoped I would reconsider, that the solicitor's fees would come from the estate, as if to suggest I were being wasteful with my own money. I showed the email to Patricia, who said to ignore it, and I did. I spent Christmas with Rena and her family in Manchester. 3 grandchildren under 10, absolute chaos, the particular exhaustion of households with small children at Christmas, which is to say, the most alive I had felt in 2 years. I slept on a fold-out in the study and woke up at 6 to the sound of feet running on the landing and a small person pressing a sticky hand against the door. I played 3 separate card games I did not understand the rules of. I ate too much. On Christmas morning, I put Victor's photograph, I had brought it in my handbag in the small frame, on the windowsill of the study, angled toward the light, and I said to it, "Look at them." And I sat there for a moment in the quiet before the house woke up properly, and I felt him very clearly, the way you can sometimes feel someone gone, not as a presence exactly, but as a warmth. I went home on the 28th and spent New Year's Eve with Dorothy, who made an excellent fish pie and was entirely sensible about the whole thing. In January, I went shopping. This was, in its way, a significant act. I had not bought clothes for myself, deliberately, with intent, as opposed to replacing worn-out things, in several years. Victor's illness, then mourning, then simply not thinking about it. There is a way that grief works on you that you don't notice while it's happening. Not only the large absences, the empty chair and the side of the bed and the habit of cooking for 2, but the small ones, the personal ones. The way you stop considering your own preferences because the weight of them seems disproportionate when set against everything else. I had stopped considering my preferences somewhere in year 5 of Victor's illness, and I had not fully started again. I went to the shops on a Thursday when they were not busy, and I spent 3 hours, which felt luxurious and slightly absurd, choosing things that were genuinely useful and that I also, separately, liked. I bought a good rain jacket, lightweight, waterproof, the kind that compresses into its own pocket, deep teal, because the woman in the shop said it suited me, and I looked in the mirror and found, with some surprise, that she was right. I bought walking shoes, proper ones, supportive for the knee, tested by walking up and down the shop's small ramp several times while the assistant watched with the expression of a professional who has seen everything. I bought a small backpack that could be carried as hand luggage, chosen specifically for its numerous internal pockets, because Dorothy had once told me that the hallmark of a competent traveler was an organized bag, and she was right about most things. I bought a translation phrase book to supplement the app because I didn't entirely trust the app, and I bought from a small shop I had walked past for years without going in, a set of beautiful notebooks, Japanese ones, imported, with covers like woodblock prints, because I had decided I would write about the trip, not for anyone else, but for myself, for the practice of putting things into words. Standing in the street afterward with my bags in the thin January sun, I felt something I identified, after a moment's consideration, as readiness. Not the anxious readiness of someone who has completed a checklist, but the quieter, more grounded kind that comes from having made real decisions about real things. 4 months. I could wait 4 months. I sent him a text message because I had decided that a phone call would have given him an opportunity to try again, to argue, to escalate. The text said, "Flying to Tokyo tomorrow morning. 3 weeks. I'll have my mobile with me if there's a genuine emergency. Speak when I'm back." I turned off the read receipts so I wouldn't know if he'd seen it. Then I finished packing my small case and I went to bed at 9, which was not the time I normally went to bed, but which seemed prudent given a 5:30 alarm. I didn't sleep well. This I will admit freely. I lay in the dark and I thought about the 16-hour flight and whether my knee would manage. And I thought about whether I had packed too much or not enough. And I thought about navigating the Tokyo metro system, which looked, in the guidebook, genuinely complex. I thought about being 68 and alone and very far from home. I thought about all the things Conrad had said, laid out like items in a catalog: the risks, the language barrier, the healthcare system, the statistics on falls. And I noticed, lying there in the dark, that the thoughts did not frighten me the way they might have frightened me 6 months ago. They presented themselves, and I looked at them, and I set them down, one by one, like objects I didn't need to carry. I had packed the guidebooks and the phrasebook and the translation app and the travel insurance documentation and the emergency contact card in English and Japanese that Patricia's assistant had helped me print. I had packed a small first aid kit and my blood pressure medication in 2 separate places in case one bag was lost. I had packed sensible shoes and the good rain jacket and exactly the right number of layers for April weather in a country I had researched extensively. I had not packed fear. I had considered it. I had decided against it. Still, sleep would not come. At midnight, I got up and went downstairs in my dressing gown, the way I had on the morning Victor died. Same kitchen, same refrigerator hum, same boiler ticking as it cooled down for the night. I put the kettle on, not because I wanted tea particularly, but because the act of making tea was the correct response to being awake at midnight. And I stood at the counter while it boiled, and I looked at the dark window and my own reflection in it. A woman in a dressing gown with her hair not done, and I thought, you are about to fly to Japan. I had never flown alone. This is the thing I had not told anyone, because it seemed, given the other things happening, a small and embarrassing admission. Victor and I had gone to France twice in our marriage, once for our anniversary, once with the children. And on both occasions, Victor had handled the checking in, the gate, the particular compressed anxiety of airports. I had sat beside him and been grateful and not thought about what it would be like to do it myself. I had also not gone anywhere much since because the children were young. And then they weren't young, but we had no money. And then we had a little money, but Victor's knees. And then the proper illness. And 41 years had passed, and I had been to France twice. But I had managed the solicitor. I had managed the LPA objection, which was a more genuinely difficult and frightening thing than any airport, because it had a real human adversary with a real intention behind it. I had managed 6 months of gray, which is harder than it sounds, the way managing quietly is always harder than the dramatic versions of hard things. I had managed every Tuesday at the library, where 11-year-olds asked me impossible questions about fiction, and I answered them. And I had managed the Sunday calls with the steady voice. And I had managed, on a Thursday afternoon, to tell my son that my time was my own. An airport was a corridor that ended at a seat on a plane. I could manage a corridor. The tea was good. I sat at the kitchen table with it, and I looked at the chrysanthemums in their vase, yellow and starting to go soft at the edges because I had bought them last week and forgotten to change the water. And I thought about Victor as I did most nights, the quiet end-of-day thinking that had replaced the first months of sharp grief. I thought about the wallet photograph. I thought about 1991, a park bench, a sandwich he hadn't finished, and a man with a penknife being careful with a page of a magazine. 32 years of careful. I thought, I am going for both of us. There is a kind of decision that settles when you make it properly. Not the anxious kind of decision that you keep revisiting, pulling at the edges to check if it will hold, but the kind that simply sits in you, weight-bearing, taking up its space with the authority of something true. I had made this decision in September, looking at the photograph in the nightstand, and I had not undone it. Not for Conrad's folder, not for the LPA, not for the long, uncertain nights between October and April. It had simply stayed there, the decision, solid as the kitchen table under my hands. I finished the tea. I rinsed the cup. I went back upstairs and I reached across the bed, properly, deliberately, the first time since March. And I turned on Victor's lamp, the small one on his nightstand, and I looked at the photograph on the dresser, small in its frame. The lake, the mountain doubled, the sky that streaks pink and gold at dawn, as if someone had decided that ordinary light would not do for this particular mountain. Right, I said, out loud, to no one, and also to him. Here we go. I turned off the lamp. I lay back on my side, and eventually, the refrigerator humming, the house settling around me in the dark, the small weight of the packed suitcase at the end of the bed, like a patient, solid companion, I slept. Tokyo was nothing like I had expected, which is to say that it was more of everything. More color, more noise, more smell, more sensation. The airport alone was a small country, clean and bewilderingly well organized, and I want to tell you about arriving in it, because it mattered in ways I hadn't anticipated. The plane landed at Haneda at 6 a.m. local time, which was the middle of the night by my body's reckoning, and I had slept perhaps 4 hours across the 16-hour flight, cramped against the window in economy class with my neck at an angle that would speak to me for 2 days afterward. I had watched 3 films I didn't particularly choose, eaten whatever was put in front of me, drunk a great deal of water because the phrase book had been very firm about hydration on long flights, and had at some point over Russia experienced a period of approximately 40 minutes during which the weight of what I was doing, flying alone at 68 to a country where I knew no one to fulfill a dead man's dream, landed on me with its full significance. I did not panic. I sat with it, which is a different thing, and I breathed, and outside the window was the dark and the stars at altitude, and eventually the feeling passed, and I ate a second bread roll because it was there. Customs at Haneda was orderly and quick. My Japanese on the immigration form was limited to the hotel name, which I had written out in both English and the Japanese characters I had copied carefully from the booking confirmation. The officer looked at the form, looked at me, stamped my passport, and said, "Enjoy Japan," in accented but entirely clear English, and something in the simple normalcy of this, the ordinary bureaucratic courtesy of it, steadied me enormously. I collected my case from the carousel and I found the train information desk and I asked, in English, how to get to Shinjuku, and the young man behind the desk explained it to me with a map and a highlighter, and I took the highlighted map and I went to find the right platform. The train from the airport was the smoothest thing I had ever been on. It moved with a silence and a precision that felt almost theoretical, as if it were demonstrating what a train could be if a train tried very hard. I sat with my case on the rack above me and my handbag in my lap, and I watched Tokyo accumulate outside the window. Slowly at first, industrial, the backs of warehouses and elevated roads. Then denser, residential, the stacked apartments and the narrow streets, and the particular way the city had of repeating its own pattern endlessly in every direction. Buildings and signs and the small, precise shapes of things. And I felt something unlock in my chest that I hadn't realized was locked. I was here. It was not complicated. It was not even entirely comfortable. I was exhausted, and my neck ached, and I was not entirely sure I was on the right train. But I was here, in a train in Tokyo, watching the city assemble itself in the April morning light, and it was real, and it was mine. The hotel in Shinjuku was exactly as the photographs had promised. The woman at reception spoke excellent English and gave me a room on the 14th floor overlooking a park, bare-branched in April, but with something beginning, a suggestion of pink at the tips of the branches that I recognized from the guidebook as the beginning of the cherry blossom. Right on time, after all. I stood at the window for a long time that first evening, my coat still on, my suitcase not yet unpacked, and I looked at Tokyo in the dark, all lit up and indifferent and enormous. And I felt, under the exhaustion and the disorientation and the slightly unreal quality of having arrived somewhere entirely new and entirely alone, a bedrock steadiness that I recognized, eventually, as the sensation of being exactly where you are supposed to be. I was in Tokyo for 6 days before I went to Kyoto, and in those 6 days, I did the following things. I rode the metro successfully every single day, including once taking a wrong line and correcting myself without incident. I ate ramen at a counter restaurant where I was the only non-Japanese person, and I ordered by pointing at the menu and nodding. And it was the best ramen I have ever eaten, and possibly the best soup of any kind. I visited a shrine in Harajuku where someone had left hundreds of small paper cranes strung on a wire, and I stood among them for 20 minutes because I could not make myself leave. I had tea in a tea house in Ueno, served by a young woman who walked with a deliberateness that made every movement look like a considered choice. I got rained on in Akihabara and sheltered in a department store basement that sold things I had never conceived of, including, memorably, a section dedicated exclusively to extremely elaborate stationery. I bought a note card there, gold-edged, with a print of herons on one side for Dorothy. I thought of Conrad occasionally, not with bitterness, or not only with bitterness, but with the kind of clear-eyed assessment you can only manage at a sufficient distance. I thought about the folder, the statistics, the phrase, "you've had your time." I thought about how certain he had been, how completely, without question, he had known better. And I thought about how easy certainty is when you have never tested yourself against the world on its own terms, when you have always been the one with the folder, making the decisions, guiding others through paperwork you understood better than they did. I was not angry exactly. I was something more interesting. I had passed through anger back in October and come out the other side into something I can only call clarity. The kind you get when you finally see a thing as it is, not as you needed it to be. On the 4th day, I went to Asakusa. Sensoji is one of those places that photographs cannot adequately prepare you for. Not because the photographs are inaccurate, but because they leave out the quality of the air, the incense and the people and the sound. Not loud exactly, but layered, complex. The sound of a place that has been doing the same things for centuries and has no intention of stopping. I walked the path to the main hall slowly, because of the knee and because there was no reason to hurry, and I watched people pray. Watched them bow. Watched them cast their fortunes. Watched an elderly couple, much older than me, moving through the space with the easy familiarity of people who had been here many times before. The man had his hand at the woman's elbow, not guiding her, just resting there. She did not need guiding. She moved with confidence, her small steps certain on the paving stones. He walked beside her because he wanted to be beside her. There was no other reason. I stood and watched them for too long, probably. There is a kind of grief that arrives sideways, in quiet moments, in the middle of beautiful places, when you are not expecting it. It is not the sharp grief of the early months. It is something older, softer, and in its way, heavier. I stood by the incense burner. You are supposed to waft the smoke toward you for good health, and I did, and it stung my eyes in a way that explained several things about the state of my face. And I thought about Victor standing in this exact spot, which he had always meant to do, and I felt the particular ache of knowing that some things come too late for some people. But I had come. I was here. This also was true. At a small stall near the temple exit, I bought a set of postcards. Tokyo by night, the temple gate, cherry blossoms, the usual, and one of Mount Fuji at dawn. I bought that one twice because I wanted one to keep. In a cafe nearby, over green tea that arrived with a small sweet on the side, I addressed the cards. Dorothy, Rena, the grandchildren. The woman from my book club who had called me twice before I left to say she thought I was wonderful, and once to ask who had done my travel insurance. And Conrad. I sat with his card for a while. The cafe around me was quiet, mid-morning, a few other customers on their laptops, the sound of something calm and instrumental on the speaker system. I turned the Mount Fuji card over in my hands. The photograph from Victor's wallet was in my bag, still in the small frame, because I had carried it with me every day of the trip. I took it out and set it on the table, and I looked at it, and I looked at the postcard, and I thought about what I wanted to say. I wrote 9 words. I put a stamp on it. I added it to the pile to post. In Kyoto, the cherry blossoms came. The guidebook had warned me, and I had seen the news reports, the weather forecasts, the anxious articles about peak bloom. But none of this prepared me for the actual experience of standing in the grounds of Maruyama Park at 8 in the morning with a cup of coffee from a vending machine, watching the light come through trees that had turned overnight into something that did not look quite real. Pink and white and utterly excessive, petals falling without wind in a slow, continuous drift, landing on the paths, on the pond, on the shoulders of the other early risers who stood among the trees looking slightly stunned, as if they too had been ambushed by beauty. I stood there for a long time. I thought about Victor, who would have stood here open-mouthed and tried immediately to describe it, and then laughed at himself for not having the words. I thought about my knee, which was doing remarkably well, all things considered. I thought about my daughter, who had sent me a series of increasingly enthusiastic texts since I'd left. Mom, have you tried matcha yet? Mom, you have to go to Nishiki Market. Mom, the kids want to know if you saw any ninjas. And I thought about Dorothy, who had sent exactly one message that read, "Report back," and whose restraint I found deeply comforting. And I thought about the house in Harrowfield, the new locks, the mahogany nightstand that now had nothing in its drawer except a notebook and a pack of tissues and a church bulletin. The LPA objection had been upheld. Patricia had called me 2 days before I flew to confirm. The registration had been refused. Whatever Conrad had been planning, Whatever he had imagined he would do with the authority that document would have given him, it was over. The will had been revised. I was the executor of my own estate, with Patricia's firm as professional backup and Rena named for oversight because I trusted her, cautiously but genuinely. The locks were changed. Conrad had a copy of the new arrangement delivered by registered post because Patricia had insisted on documentation for everything. He hadn't responded. I had not expected him to yet. I went to Fushimi Inari the next day, the 1,000-torii gates, orange and red, winding up the hillside through the trees. I climbed for almost 2 hours, which was further than I had planned, but the path kept presenting another turn, another gate, another reason to continue, and my knee cooperated better than I deserved given the gradient. Near the top, where the crowds had thinned and the trees pressed close on either side and the city of Kyoto lay visible below through a gap in the cedars, gray and white and very far away, I stopped and I took out the photograph for the last time. The lake and the mountain, the doubled sky. I took my own photograph of it, there at the top of the hill, with Kyoto in the background. The light was right. Later, when I had it printed, it would look as if Fuji and Kyoto existed in the same frame, the same world, which of course they do, but which is easy to forget. We made it, I said, to the photograph, to the air, to the city below and the mountains somewhere to the northeast, behind clouds. A bit late, but we made it. I climbed back down, my knee held. The gates were still orange in the afternoon light. I flew home on a Saturday. The house felt different when I walked in, or I felt different walking into it. It is hard to say which. The same smell of old wood and the particular dust of old books. The same sound of the refrigerator humming its off-key note. But something altered in the relationship between me and these things, as if the house had stayed the same and I had moved. Not away from it, into a different position relative to it, a slightly better vantage point. I unpacked, I did laundry, I called Rena, who shrieked delightedly and made me promise to come to Manchester and show the grandchildren the photographs. I called Dorothy, who said, and I said, and everything, and she said, good. I did not call Conrad. He rang on Sunday morning, as he always did, and I let the call go to voicemail. He did not leave a message, which was itself a message. He came on a Thursday, 3 weeks after I returned. He rang the bell, rang it because his key no longer worked, and I opened the door and he was standing on the step and he looked, for the first time in as long as I could remember, simply tired. Not calculating, not managing, just tired. "Can I come in?" he said. "Yes," I said, and I opened the door wider, and he came in and we went to the kitchen and I put the kettle on. We sat at the table. He didn't bring a folder. He looked at the kitchen, at the yellow chrysanthemums I still kept on the table, at the small frame on the windowsill that now held the photograph I had taken at Fushimi Inari, the photo of the Fuji photograph with Kyoto in the background. He looked at it for a moment. "Is that?" he started. "It's a photo I took in Japan," I said, "of your father's photograph." He was quiet. "Conrad," I said, "I am not going to pretend that what happened didn't happen. I am not able to do that. What you did was a serious thing. Not because it was illegal, though it was, or very close to it, but because of what it meant. What it said about how you see me, and what you were prepared to do." He looked at the table. His jaw was tight. I thought, "I know what you thought," I said. "You thought you knew better. You've thought that for a long time, and there is a version of caring for someone that looks exactly like that, exactly like taking over, managing, deciding. And sometimes people need that. Sometimes that is the right thing." I paused. I did not need it. I was not the person you had decided I was. I was worried about you, he said, and it sounded now, stripped of the boardroom voice, stripped of the strategy, like something true. I know, I said, but you were also wrong. The kettle boiled. I made the tea. I set his cup in front of him and sat back down. The LPA is gone, I said. The will has been revised. The locks are changed. Those things are not changing back. I wrapped both hands around my cup. What can change is what comes next, if you want there to be a next. He looked up. His eyes, Victor's eyes, were tired and something I was not used to seeing there, uncertain. I want there to be a next, he said. Then you need to understand something, I said. I am not waiting to die. I am not living in reserve. I am not done with anything. I am 68 years old. I am in reasonable health. My finances are my own. My house is my own. And my time, I held his gaze, my time is entirely my own, whatever is left of it. And it is not yours to allocate. He said nothing, but he nodded, slowly, once. We drank our tea. It took a long time. We talked about Rena and the grandchildren. We talked about the garden, which needed attention before winter properly set in. We talked about very little, carefully, like two people finding the edges of something fragile, testing where the pressure could safely go. He did not apologize, not in so many words. Conrad was never a man of direct apologies. But he asked questions about the trip, real ones, not polite ones. He asked about the food. He asked, looking at the photo on the windowsill, about Fushimi Inari. I told him about the gates, the light through the trees, the city below. Did you, he started and stopped. Did I what? Did you take anything of Dad's? I just wondered. His photograph, I said. I took it with me. I had it with me every day. His face did something complicated. He looked away at the window. He left an hour later. I stood at the door as he walked to his car, and he turned at the gate and raised a hand, and I raised mine, and he drove away. Not fixed, not resolved, but not gone. Something at the edges, still in contact. I went back to the kitchen and sat for a while. Outside, the last of the autumn light came slanted through the window above the sink, the same window it had always come through, laying the same pale strips across the table. I looked at the photograph on the windowsill, the one I'd taken at the top of the hill. Fushimi Inari, Kyoto below. And within the photo, small but clear, Victor's photograph, the lake, the mountain, the sky. I got up and made a fresh cup of tea, and I brought it back to the table, and I sat in the golden, fading afternoon in my own house, in my own kitchen, in the life that was mine to live, and I drank it slowly, all the way to the bottom. The following Tuesday, I went back to the library. Jean at the desk said, "You look different." And I said I'd been away, and she said, "No, it's something else." And I said, "Perhaps it was." In the spring, Rena brought the children down for a week, and I took them to the coast. And the youngest sat on my lap on the train and fell asleep against my shoulder, small and heavy and warm, and I held her and watched the countryside go past the window, the fields and the hedgerows and the particular English green of the hills, and I thought, this. Also this. All of it. I started planning the next trip in February. Not Japan again, not yet. I was thinking of Peru. The altitude might be a concern, I had read, but I had also read about acclimatization, and I had the translation app, and I knew now with a certainty I had not had before that I was the kind of woman who could manage. Dorothy, when I told her, laughed and said she was coming with me. Absolutely not, I said, smiling. Try and stop me, she said. Victor's photograph sits on my dresser now, in its small frame, where it has been since the night before I flew. I sleep on my side of the bed most nights. Some nights, I still reach across to the other side, out of habit or something older than habit, and I let my hand rest there for a moment on the cool cotton, and I think about all the years and all the ordinary mornings and what it means to have had them. Then I pull my hand back to my own side and I close my eyes and I sleep. I have not forgotten what Conrad said that October morning. I expect I never will. But I have set it down beside other things I know to be true, and it has found its proper size, which is small. A mistake made by someone who misunderstood who I was and what I was capable of. It does not define me. It does not define him entirely either. He is more than his worst instinct, as we all are. And whether the version of him that drank tea in my kitchen that Thursday becomes the version I know going forward is a question that will answer itself, slowly, over time. What I know is this. I am 68 years old, and I have seen Mount Fuji's reflection in a lake the color of mercury at dawn. And I have climbed 1,000 orange gates in the company of a photograph my husband carried for 32 years. And I have sent a postcard with 9 words on the back. And I have come home. The chrysanthemums are fresh on the table. The tea is good. The house is mine. Sonny, my time is just beginning.